As the war in Syria enters its 8th year, swathes of the country remain under rebel control. Now, with Turkish and Israeli incursions into Syria, a prevailing stalemate between the Iranian-backed Assad regime, rebel groups and a US-led coalition of Kurdish forces threatens to erupt into a broader regional conflict. Dr. Jonathan Spire is the Executive Director of the Middle East Centre for Reporting and Analysis. He spent years reporting on the ground for both the Iraq and Syrian wars. He says although the Assad regime has been on the front foot, the conflict is far from over.
Well, at the moment, the Syrian war is in a situation in which the Assad regime has certainly achieved a great deal of advancement against the rebels. The rebellion remains in only three isolated points of the country in the southwest, northwest and southeast. The war of the global coalition against ISIS has also progressed such that ISIS now possesses Islamic State possesses just a couple of areas of control in the country. But having said that, the war remains far from over, I think. The rebellion is not destroyed in its entirety. ISIS too, as we saw in recent days, is still capable of launching counterattacks. And indeed, you know, with the ownership by the Americans and their Kurdish allies of around 30% of the country east of the Euphrates, and the determination by the Assad regime to reconquer that too, there's a sense in which even once the conflicts between rebels and regime and ISIS and coalition are concluded, there, I'm afraid, will be a scope for then the emergence of further conflicts, you know, beginning on the ruins of the old.
And then what would that conflict look like, and what would the politics around it be?
The Syrian regime is on record, as I say, President Bashar Assad and his foreign minister Walid Mualem are on record as saying that they are determined to liberate, as they call it, the entirety of their land. At present, as I said, the Americans and Kurds control around 30% of the country east of the Euphrates. The Turks also control an enclave in the northwest of the country. So presumably, if the regime is determined to take back those areas, then there's a real possibility, one way or another, of conflict between the Assad regime and its allies on the one hand, Iran and Russia perhaps also behind it, and those elements. Now, it's hard to conceive of a situation in which there would be a sort of frontal conflict between those forces, because that's something which I think would be beyond the Assad regime's capabilities. But the Assad regime is very good at sponsoring proxies, very good at fomenting insurgencies, and therefore I think there's a real possibility of efforts by the regime and perhaps their Iranian allies to foment instability inside the areas currently controlled by the Kurds with their American allies and the Turks. So I think an ongoing process of sort of a number of crisscrossing de facto insurgencies on the soil of Syria for the foreseeable future is the most likely outcome. We're not heading for a situation yet in which any strong central government is set to reimpose its authority throughout the entirety of Syria.
So you're saying that Assad, though, has accomplished a lot of what he wanted to achieve. Little prospect of the war ending, which is very disturbing. Is it going to morph into something other than a conflict?
You know, unless something political shifts, unless either Turkey or the United States or both choose to quit Syria of their own accord, it is likely that that de facto division and therefore the ongoing reality of conflict will remain. I think we should also add the fact, as we've seen in recent weeks, that there is an additional conflict taking place over the soil of Syria, and that's a conflict between Israel and Iran, in which Iran has come on, with great strength onto Syrian soil in the course of the war. Israel is deeply concerned about that because of Iran's determination to fight against Israel, and therefore Israel is determined to act to prevent the consolidation of the Iranian presence on Syrian soil. So there's kind of a whole bunch of potential successor conflicts that are already, beginning to make themselves manifest, even as the original Syrian conflicts of regime against rebellion and coalition against Islamic State are not themselves yet completely concluded.
And do you think Israel has become emboldened because the United States thinks that their job is done, that they actually want to get out of Syria now?
Well, with regard to the United States, I think there's a debate taking place in the administration, and to some degree I think there's a certain lack of clarity with regard to the American stance. Because whilst some weeks ago President Trump was on record as saying that he wanted all US troops home within 6 months since the war against ISIS was largely concluded. Since then, there have been statements by senior officials, including Defence Secretary James Mattis, which appeared to suggest a much more open-ended commitment of the United States to its allies in Syria, and specifically in eastern Syria. There is an issue which is with regard to the emergent US strategy, which also seeks to contain and roll back Iranian advances in the region. If such a strategy is to clearly emerge, then the ownership, so to speak, or domination of eastern Syria in cooperation with Kurdish allies has a relevance there, because ownership of that area basically sort of cuts in half the otherwise contiguous area of Iranian influence in both Iraq and Syria further west. So if such a strategy is to emerge, it is possible that the current US deployment in eastern Syria may sort of be folded into that strategy, in which case one might well see a much longer term US commitment of one kind or another inside the 30% of Syria, which the US with their allies currently control de facto.
And Jonathan, speaking of Iran, what did you make of Donald Trump's decision to tear up the Iran nuclear deal? And do you think Israel is justified in a way with its actions because of the increasing assertiveness of Iran in recent times?
Well, the Iranians have been advancing in a number of fronts, so to speak, in recent years, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, and in Yemen. With regard to Israel's concerns, I mean, it was only 2 weeks ago when Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei of Iran, sent out a tweet in which he called for the destruction of Israel, which he referred to as a cancerous tumour in West Asia. So I think, obviously any country which finds itself described like that by a neighbour, one wouldn't be surprised to see that there are some concerns regarding that, particularly given the Iranian advance, the Iranian sponsorship of paramilitary organisations in a variety of countries, including countries neighbouring Israel. One thinks most clearly, of course, or most immediately, of course, of the Hezbollah organisation of Lebanon, committed to Israel's destruction and with a mass of around 150,000 rockets and missiles pointed at Israel at the present time. With regard to the issue of the Trump administration's decision to abandon the nuclear agreement, I think to some degree one needs again to consider this in light of the broader context of Iranian expansion. It was interesting to note that Secretary of State Pompeo issued a statement just a couple of weeks ago with 12 demands which Iran is asked, or which they demand Iran comply with in order to achieve a new nuclear agreement. And many of those demands did not relate to the nuclear file itself, but rather they related to Iranian expansionism into Yemen, into Lebanon, into Syria, and so on. So there's a sense that there is an emergent US strategy seeking to contain or perhaps roll back Iranian influence in the region. Israel, of course, has long been concerned about that expansion. Israel has long been a target of that expansion, and Israel will certainly be a keen partner, so to speak, in any effort to seek to contain and roll back Iranian advances.
Jonathan, appreciate your perspective on all of this. Thank you.
Most are welcome.